Hello, and welcome to this short podcast on the French Revolution, slavery. We'll begin with a quote by this wonderful woman who said that, "Why are black people enslaved? The colour of people's skins only suggests a slight difference. There is no discord between day and night, the sun and moon, and between the stars and the dark sky. All is varied. It is the beauty of nature. Why destroy nature's work?" We've discussed her many a time, but I just want you to actually look at the date here, is 1788, which suggests that there is, of course, talk of abolition of slavery occurring prior to the famous events of 1789. So let's begin by having a look at where this fits into the study design. We have, of course, our four overarching questions, and I think that if this is going to work, okay, it's not. The last two there. So how did the revolution affect the experiences of those who lived through it? And to what extent was society changed and revolutionary ideas achieved? So I think they're the two, there we go, now it is, the two key ones that we can focus on here. Whereabouts in the study design do we find this little bad boy slavery? So here we go. Oh, hello. There it is there. So this one little keynote, but it is listed, meaning that, of course, it could pop up on the exam. Hence the abolition of slavery. Let's begin by looking at the background to the issue. So the late 17th century treaty, of course, a lot of the colonies in America and we talk about North, Central and South America, okay, and the Caribbean, went back and forth between various European powers. I don't think you'll remember the name of this treaty, so let's just recognise it and move on. But according from the treaty of the late 17th century, of course, this country here, Haiti, or what it was previously called Saint Dominique, was ceded to France. Okay, and it became very prosperous. The country's colony's population and economic output grew rapidly through the 18th century. It was exporting lots of stuff. I think I read somewhere that at one point in time, about 70% of the world's coffee was coming from this region. Hence, it has value economically. Right after the 7 Years' War, France still held on to this lucrative trade, and we know that there was around 750,000, so that's no small number by any means, slaves in French colonies. Okay, I want you to think now in terms of the worldview. There was definitely criticisms of slavery at this point in time. We've got famously this anti-slavery abolitionist propaganda, okay, which spread through France, England, and of course the Americas. I think it originated from the Quakers. Here we go. I am not a man. Am I not a man and a brother? Okay, and a picture, of course, of an enslaved person in chains. And of course, the French revolutionaries and many people at this time were very familiar with this concept of being chained. Okay, we can think about one of the philosophers, Rousseau, of course, who spoke about chains and the breaking of chains, which also appears in other French propaganda. But I digress. Let's move on. So what people were, aside from the Quakers, let's now think about French. What people were, of course, talking about the abolition of slavery. We have this wonderful man here, Brissot. You might remember him because, he does many things and, of course, has his head chopped off later on. He formed the Society of the Friends of the Blacks. Okay, it might have been to join this group. People would have been very passionate about it, but it also might have included others that were just kind of on board in one of the fads of the French Revolution, including, of course, Sayet and Lafayette. By about 1789, you had 141 members, prominent members. As I said, it's based on the ideas of the Quakers of the US abolitionist organisation. But what is interesting is that membership is open to men, women, and French citizens and foreigners. So open membership here. Again, of course, you've got one group advocating for change. And as always happens in history, this faces opposition. In this instance, you've got this club here, okay, which of course is made up of rich French merchants. They conducted powerful scare campaigns, threatened violence against the abolitionists, even tried to suggest that this group here, the Society of Friends of the Blacks, were actually plotting secretly with the English and the Spanish, of course, for a slave revolt. which is quite interesting because we'll find out that later on. But the other thing we need to take into account is 1/10 of the deputies actually own colonial property, and many of them actually own slaves themselves. And if you have a valuable economic resource, it's kind of hard we see in history, for people to give this up willingly. Nonetheless, let's now turn our attention to the Dormac and the French Revolution. And when the French Revolution begins, and the wonderful declarations, including Article Number 1, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, this idea does spread to the colonies, okay? And those of mixed race began to discuss the rights of free blacks and, of course, enslaved blacks. So what happens? Over time, we see that there are 3 rebellions. The first 2 rebellions take place in 1790, and they take place in response to the Assembly. Notice that I'm going to change with time the Assembly, which becomes the Convention, okay? Refusal to grant them rights in line with the principles of the Revolution. There are 2, of course, rebellions in March and October 1790. What are the ramifications? By 1791, we have Robespierre, who does convince the Assembly to grant rights to freed slaves, but he does this only if they were born to 2 freed parents. And a year later, in April, okay, so a little under a year later, we see that these rights are universal regardless of parentage. A few months after this, we have our 3rd rebellion, okay, so prior to all rights being granted. And this is the big one, okay, where you have on the 2nd of August in 1791, okay, this is a rebellion that's been celebrated throughout history and the history of the world. Okay, it was the first successful slave revolt or rebellion in history. Spartacus might have something to say with that. Nonetheless, the National Assembly reacts by rescinding the rights. Okay, and once again, the slaves respond to this with violence, a feature common to the French Revolution. Burn down plantations, they murder white masters, they attack the towns, they even attack freed slaves. And what caused it was resentment. So the Assembly refused to extend freedom and equality to slaves. Okay, but another thing, and why didn't they do that? Because of course the French economy was in tatters. We know that, and without these possessions, perhaps it posed a very serious threat to France itself. Another thing that we need to consider is between 1789 and 1791, 100,000 new slaves have arrived at this valuable colony of France. I mean, isn't that just unbelievable, these numbers? And it shows how huge the slave trade actually was at this time. But these slaves had not been beaten into submission or obedience, such as the older slaves had. And they were actually, did have access to revolutionary rhetoric and pamphlets, exposing the ideas of liberty and equality. And it inspires many of them. It inspires, of course, this gentleman here, who is famous. He leads 100,000 slaves. Okay, again, they use violence. They slaughter royal officials, white plantation owners, and even people of colour. So free coloured people who were previously slaves or had not been slaves. And by early 1792, he controls about 1/3 of the island. Okay, so much so that Robespierre and the Convention respond by sending a couple of dignitaries out to see what's happened. We also have this gentleman here, who again organised the guerrilla troops. We'll find out that later on he actually sides with the English and the French to kind of force, the English and the Spanish to force the hand of the French. Okay, but later on he reverts back. I think 1795 reverts back with the French to actually fight the Spanish and British. So it was kind of an astute political move. So the response, Legislative Assembly, they meet at the end of March 1792. They voted to reinstate the political rights of free blacks, but they don't talk about what they're going to do with slavery. There's an expansion of war. We know that France has war with Austria and Prussia, of course, but famously they also declare war on Britain and Spain in February 1793, and it leads to new problems in the colony. Now, let's not forget that Britain and Spain have their hands in many pies, including this region of the world. So they actually try and enlist planters to help them take the island, and the Spanish help fund the rebels. The rebel slaves actually made formal agreements, as I said, with the British and Spanish. Okay, the British and Spanish did not want their own slaves to be free at this point in time, but they definitely realised that it would be a threat to France's economy. Okay, and make those internally within France itself respond. So the economy almost collapses. Drastic measures are needed. The National Convention, led by Robespierre, finally votes to end slavery, and this comes into effect in February the 4th, 1794. Thousands of whites at the time respond by fleeing the island. Those of mixed colour are not pleased. Many slave owners were opposed to the move. I'm going to leave it there. There is extra reading if you are interested on this gentleman here. But again, what we need to think of is to what extent was society changed and revolutionary ideas achieved, and how did the revolution affect the experience of those who lived through it, including those who lived not in France itself, but in the French colonies. Thanks. Bye.